Tonight, we follow the life of a player who seemed ready, long before he should have been. There is something difficult to explain about watching a very young footballer who does not seem young. Not in the way they move, not in the way they receive the ball, and certainly not in the way they decide what to do with it. Most teenagers in professional football betray their age in small ways. A hesitation before the pass, a look down at the ball when they should already be looking up, a reaction that arrives just a fraction too late. These moments are normal. They are part of the process of becoming. But occasionally, there is a player who seems to have skipped that phase entirely. A player who operates with the composure of someone who has already spent 10 years solving these problems, who moves into space before the space is obvious to anyone else on the pitch, who releases the ball not when the pressure forces them to, but before the pressure even builds. Watching that kind of player at 16 or 17 years old produces a very specific feeling, not just admiration, something closer to quiet disbelief. The question it raises is not simply whether this player is talented. The question is something more precise. How did they come to understand the game so completely, so early? What combination of environment, education, circumstance, and something harder to name produced that kind of readiness? Tonight, we follow one answer to that question, one career that offers a window into how football intelligence develops and why it sometimes arrives long before anyone expects it. Cesc Fàbregas was born on the 4th of May, 1987, in Arenys de Mar. It is a small coastal town in Catalonia, northeast of Barcelona, sitting where the land meets the Mediterranean. The town is modest in size, but sits within a region that has always had a particular relationship with football. Catalonia, and Barcelona in particular, had by the mid-1980s developed a footballing culture, unlike anywhere else in Spain. It was not simply that people cared about the game, though they did deeply. It was that the game was thought about differently there. The values of the region's dominant club had begun filtering down into youth football in ways that were not yet fully visible to the outside world. Ball retention, spatial positioning, short combinations. The idea that controlling possession was not merely a tactic, but an expression of footballing philosophy. Cesc Fàbregas grew up breathing that air. Football was present in his family, present in his neighborhood, and would soon become the organizing principle of his young life. He joined FC Barcelona's youth academy, La Masia, as a child. The decision was not a dramatic one at the time. Many talented Catalan children found their way there. What made La Masia distinctive was not only that it attracted gifted players, but that it then subjected those players to a very specific kind of education. The academy had been formalized in the late 1970s, operating out of a farmhouse that gave it its name, which translates simply as the farmhouse. By the time Fabregas arrived, it had been shaped by years of deliberate thought about how to develop footballers from the inside out. The emphasis was not on physical conditioning or athletic development in the conventional sense. It was on understanding, on teaching young players how to read the game rather than simply how to play it. Coaches at La Masia worked on positioning first. They asked young players to understand where they should be before the ball arrived, not after. They placed enormous weight on the first touch, not because they wanted players to control the ball elegantly, but because they understood that the first touch was where information was processed and the next action was already being prepared. A good first touch at La Masia meant a touch that immediately set up the pass, a touch that kept the body open to the next option, a touch that was already the beginning of the subsequent movement. This educational framework shaped Fabregas at an age when other young players were still learning the most basic principles of the game. He spent years being trained not simply to kick the ball accurately or to run with it efficiently, but to think, to scan before receiving, to identify the available passing options before the ball reached him, to understand which teammate was under pressure and which had time. This kind of cognitive training, embedded in a young player during the critical developmental years between 8 and 12, produces something that is very difficult to acquire later. It produces what looks from the outside like intuition, but is actually a form of deeply practiced pattern recognition. Fabregas was being educated in the language of football at a time when his brain was most capable of absorbing and retaining it. He was not simply learning how to play. He was learning how to think. His time at La Masia would not, however, continue into his senior career at Barcelona. The decision to leave was made when Fabregas was still a very young teenager, and it was made, at least in part, because the pathway at Barcelona seemed blocked. The club had extraordinary talent in his position, and the realistic prospect of breaking into the first team through the academy system was complicated by that depth. Arsène Wenger and Arsenal had been watching him, and Wenger's approach to young players was well known by then. He had a genuine track record of taking teenage talent and giving it serious, meaningful opportunity at the highest level. Arsenal made their move, and in September 2003, Fabregas moved to London. He was 16 years old. The move was a significant one in every dimension. Not just footballing, but cultural and personal. London was not Barcelona. The language was different. The climate was different. The pace of daily life was different. English football in 2003 was a particular kind of environment. The Premier League had by then been running for over a decade and had developed a physical, high-tempo identity that was quite unlike the possession-based football of Catalonia. Teams pressed aggressively. Tackles arrived quickly. The margins for hesitation on the ball were smaller than a young Spanish midfielder might have encountered at youth level. The game was played at a speed that could overwhelm even experienced players arriving from abroad, let alone a 16-year-old still learning the country's language. That Fabregas adapted as quickly as he did remains one of the most striking aspects of his early story. He trained at Arsenal's facilities and impressed almost immediately. His technical ability was evident from the first sessions. The coaches saw the quality in his passing range, in his first touch, in his understanding of angles. But what was perhaps most notable was his composure under pressure. In training environments that tested physicality and aggression, Fabregas found a way to receive the ball in tight spaces and release it before opponents could close him down. He was not doing this by being quicker than the players around him. He was doing it by receiving the ball, already knowing where it was going. The decision had been made before the touch. That is a technical and cognitive quality that physical pace cannot replicate, and it was the quality that made Wenger comfortable accelerating his introduction. On October 28, 2003, Fabregas made his competitive debut for Arsenal. He was 16 years and 177 days old, making him the youngest player to appear for the club at that time in a first-team competitive match. The occasion was a League Cup tie. The context was not the highest profile setting, but it was a professional match against professional opponents, and Fabregas did not look out of place. He was not anonymous. He touched the ball with confidence. He moved intelligently into space. He did not seem burdened by the occasion. For most 16-year-olds, a professional debut produces visible anxiety. The weight of the moment affects the body and the decision-making. Fabregas showed none of that, or if he felt it internally, it did not reach his performance. His league debut followed, and further appearances came through the second half of that season. He was training and competing alongside players at the peak of their careers in one of the most successful teams in English football. The Arsenal side of that period had just completed an entire Premier League season, unbeaten. They were a team of genuine international quality across every position. Fabregas was not simply watching these players and absorbing their example, though that exposure mattered. He was participating, being involved in tactical conversations, experiencing firsthand what elite-level footballers did in preparation and in execution. That accelerated his development in ways that youth football, however well organized, simply cannot replicate. Arsène Wenger has spoken over the years about how he sees the development of young players, and his philosophy aligns closely with what Fabregas experienced during those early years at Arsenal. Wenger believed that talent without opportunity is incomplete, that the most gifted young players needed to be trusted with real responsibility in order to develop the attributes that made them exceptional. He had seen what happened when talented teenagers were held back, managed carefully, eased into first-team environments gradually. Sometimes it worked, but he had also seen how that caution could smooth away the edges of a player's game, could reduce the urgency with which they made decisions, could acclimatize them to a level of performance just below where their potential sat. Wenger preferred to expose young talent to the full weight of the senior game because he believed that genuine pressure produced genuine development. For Fabregas, that meant playing regularly against serious opponents in competitions that mattered. He was not loaned out. He was not managed upward gradually through reserve football. He was placed in the Arsenal first team and trusted to perform. That trust was not reckless. Wenger had assessed the player's technical level and his psychological makeup, and had concluded that the exposure would benefit him. The assessment was correct, but it is worth understanding how unusual this was. Most football clubs, even those committed to youth development, would have been cautious about deploying a 16-year-old in Premier League football. The physical demands alone were considered a risk. Wenger's willingness to look past conventional risk assessment and trust the evidence of what he was seeing in training was a critical factor in what followed. By the 2004 to 2005 season, Fabregas was a regular contributor. He was 17, and he was playing in the Premier League. His role developed as the season progressed. He was not yet the controlling presence he would become, but he was already showing the characteristics that would define his best years. His passing was crisp and purposeful. He rarely wasted the ball. He moved well between the lines, finding pockets of space in central areas where he could receive and distribute. He understood angles in ways that simpler midfielders did not. When a teammate had the ball under pressure, Fabregas was already moving to offer the simplest possible option, making himself available in space, while others were still reacting to the situation. That spatial generosity, the willingness to work for the team's benefit rather than his own position, was something he had absorbed at La Masia and brought with him to Arsenal. His style of play at that age deserves careful examination because it was genuinely unusual. Teenage midfielders in English football typically operated in one of a few modes. They either competed physically, using their energy and athleticism to press and run and challenge, or they relied on a specific technical skill, pace, or a powerful shot that could influence a game in isolated moments. Fabregas did neither of those things. He did not compete physically in the aggressive, high-energy way that English football valued. He was not particularly fast over the ground, and he was not imposing physically. What he had was something entirely different. He had the ability to slow the game down in his immediate area without slowing the team down overall. He created small moments of calm within the pressure of a match, moments in which he could assess what was available and make the correct decision. Then, having made that decision, he executed it quickly. The combination of cognitive calm and technical speed was extremely hard for opponents to deal with because they could not apply the usual solutions. You could press a player who was fast because you could force him into areas where his speed was less useful. You could press a player who was hesitant because the hesitation gave you time to close him down. But pressing a player who was calm and fast in his execution was genuinely difficult. The ball was already gone before the pressure arrived. This capacity to release the ball at the moment of maximum effect, not too early, when a better option might emerge, and not too late, when the pressure would force a compromise, was something Fabregas demonstrated in even his earliest senior appearances. It is a quality that is frequently discussed in analyses of the great midfielders, but it is rarely explained with sufficient precision. What it actually requires is an accurate internal model of where the opposing players are and how quickly they are moving. A player who can predict when pressure will arrive can plan around it. A player who can only perceive pressure when it is upon them must react to it, and reactive decision-making is almost always slower and less accurate than anticipatory decision-making. Fabregas had developed this predictive quality through years of training at La Masia, where the coaching philosophy explicitly emphasized scanning and spatial awareness. The habit had been formed early enough that it was no longer effortful by the time he reached senior football. It was simply how he played. The 2005 to 2006 season marked a further deepening of his role at Arsenal. He played more minutes, took on greater responsibility in midfield, and began to show a passing range that extended beyond the short combination play he had been schooled in. He could switch the ball across long distances with accuracy. He could find runners in behind defences with through passes that split defensive lines. He could receive with his back to goal, shield, and turn in a single movement. These were not simply technical abilities. They were signs of a player who had internalized the geometry of the game, who could picture the positions of players he could not see, and calculate where to deliver the ball with accuracy. At 18, he was doing things in midfield that players did not typically do until their mid-20s, if they developed those capabilities at all. Patrick Vieira had left Arsenal for Juventus after the unbeaten season, and the departure of such an influential figure left a gap in the midfield that Arsenal's squad had to absorb collectively. Fabregas was one of the players who stepped into that space, not as a direct replacement, because his qualities were entirely different from Vieira's, but as someone who took on more of the creative burden in central areas. The increased responsibility appeared not to weigh on him, but to suit him. He was performing at a level that attracted consistent attention and increasing respect across the league. Opposition managers began to prepare specifically for him, which was itself a sign of the impact he was having. Being identified as a player that needed managing was a form of recognition that most players did not receive until much later in their careers. Arsenal's playing style under Wenger during this period was well suited to Fabregas's qualities. The team moved the ball quickly, valued technical quality, and built attacks through midfield, rather than relying on direct play. The system gave midfielders like Fabregas the license to express themselves in possession, to take risks with passes, to attempt solutions that less adventurous tactical frameworks might have discouraged. Within that environment, he could practice the kind of creative, ambitious passing that had always been his instinct. He could attempt the through ball that broke a defensive line rather than settling for the safe lateral pass. And crucially, when those attempts did not come off, which inevitably they sometimes did, he was not punished for the attempt. The culture around him encouraged boldness and accepted the errors that came with it. There were matches during his teenage years at Arsenal that demonstrated what he was becoming. Games in European competition where the quality of the opposition was higher and the margins were tighter, and where Fabregas continued to perform with the same composure he showed in domestic football. He was not a player who elevated his game for big occasions in the conventional sense. He was simply a player whose game did not diminish when the occasion became bigger. He performed consistently, which at his age was itself extraordinary, because consistency requires a level of psychological stability that most teenagers have not developed. The emotional turbulence of adolescence, the fluctuating confidence, the vulnerability to moments of poor form, the difficulty of managing the pressure of professional sport. These are barriers that young players almost always have to negotiate. Fabregas navigated them with unusual grace. The question of his psychological makeup is one that those who worked with him have touched on over the years. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that was not arrogance. He was comfortable in training environments where older, more established players dominated the dynamics. He was not intimidated by reputation, and he did not defer to seniority in ways that might have caused him to underperform. When he received the ball, he played what he saw, not what his age suggested was appropriate. That internal consistency, the refusal to be defined by how others perceived his limitations, was itself a form of maturity. It allowed him to compete on equal terms in a senior environment because he genuinely believed he belonged there, not through bravado, but through a settled confidence in his own understanding of the game. At 19, Fabregas was named club captain of Arsenal. The appointment was extraordinary in its own right, but the context made it particularly significant. Arsenal were in a period of transition. Several of the senior figures who had carried the club through its most successful period had departed, or would soon depart. Wenger was rebuilding around younger talent, and Fabregas was a central figure in that project, not just as a player, but as a symbol of what the club was attempting to become. Making him captain at that age sent a message to the squad and to the outside world about where responsibility in the team lay. It also placed considerable additional weight on a teenager. The captaincy of a Premier League club is not a ceremonial honour. It involves dealing with teammates' concerns, representing the team in communications with management, setting standards in training, and maintaining morale through difficult periods. Managing all of that, while also performing at the highest level as a player, was a significant burden. The fact that it did not appear to diminish his performances speaks again to the psychological foundations he had built. There is an argument, which those who study athlete development make carefully, that early responsibility can be a developmental accelerant, that being placed in positions of leadership before you feel entirely ready forces a kind of growth that more gradual exposure does not produce. The discomfort of the role, the necessity of making decisions and taking positions and being accountable, builds capacities that cannot be built through simpler means. Fabregas's captaincy at Arsenal may have been one of those accelerants. The responsibility shaped him further in ways that playing alone could not have. His performances in the late 2000s placed him among the most productive midfielders in European football. The goal contributions, both goals scored and assists, were consistent and significant. But raw statistics, while useful, do not fully capture what he offered. The value of a playmaker is often distributed across teammates in ways that data struggles to measure. A pass that releases a forward into space, creating an opportunity that the forward then fails to convert, does not appear in the assist column. A positional movement that drags a defender out of shape, creating the space through which a teammate then drives, is invisible to most analytical frameworks. Fabregas's contribution to Arsenal during those years was larger than the numbers suggested, because the numbers captured only the moments where his influence was directly connected to an outcome. The broader effect of having him in midfield, the way it shaped the rhythm and direction of the team's play, was something you had to watch carefully to appreciate. There were specific performances during his Arsenal years that those who followed the team closely still recall in detail. Matches against Champions League opponents, where his control of tempo made the difference between a team under pressure and a team that imposed itself. Moments in league games against direct rivals, where his ability to find the right pass at the right moment sustained attacking moves that would otherwise have broken down. He was not a player whose contributions were spectacular in the obvious sense. He was not a striker scoring acrobatic goals or a winger executing dramatic dribbles. He was a player whose influence accumulated quietly in the rhythm of play, in the chain of decisions that built toward opportunity. His relationship with Wenger deepened through these years into something that went beyond the standard manager-player dynamic. Wenger had identified Fabregas as a special talent and had made a series of decisions that shaped his development directly. The decision to play him regularly from 16, the decision to trust him with captaincy at 19, the tactical freedom that allowed him to express his creativity rather than containing it within a rigid structure. These were all deliberate choices by a manager who had thought carefully about what this player needed to develop fully. In return, Fabregas absorbed Wenger's ideas about the game and gave them expression on the pitch. He became a kind of living argument for Wenger's footballing philosophy, a demonstration that technical intelligence and creative freedom, applied with discipline, could be more effective than athletic power and tactical rigidity. Wenger's impact on Fabregas's development cannot be reduced to simple gratitude or loyalty, though both were present in how Fabregas spoke about the manager over the years. The impact was structural. Wenger provided the environment in which Fabregas's existing qualities, the ones trained at La Masia, could develop into something of full professional weight. The freedom to make decisions and take responsibility for them, the consistency of selection that built confidence, the tactical context that played to his strength. These conditions did not create the player's intelligence. That was already there. But they allowed it to expand without being constrained by the kinds of protective management that might have kept a teenager safe but limited. The period from roughly 2007 to 2011 represented Fabregas's peak years at Arsenal. He was playing at the highest level of European club competition, performing consistently for his national team and establishing a reputation as one of the best midfielders of his generation. The recognition was widespread. Coaches, analysts, and fellow players spoke of him with a respect that acknowledged both his technical gifts and the unusual intelligence he brought to the game. He was not praised in the language used for physically dominant players. He was praised in the language used for players who understood the game at a different level. That distinction mattered. It pointed to what had always been the source of his quality. Not athleticism. Understanding. His relationship with Spain's national team ran parallel to his club career throughout this period. He had represented Spain at various youth levels and moved into the senior squad as the national team was constructing what would become one of the most decorated international sides in football history. The Spain team that dominated international football from 2008 through 2012, winning 2 European championships and a World Cup, was built on the same philosophical foundations as La Masia: possession, positional intelligence, combination play, pressing in organized groups. The system suited Fabregas precisely because he had been educated in its principles from childhood. He was not learning a new way to play when he joined the national squad. He was operating in an environment built on values he had internalized years before. The competition for places in Spain's midfield was fierce. Xavi and Iniesta were among the finest midfielders in the history of the game, and Busquets had established himself as one of the most complete holding players in the world. Getting consistent minutes in a midfield of that quality was its own achievement, regardless of Fabregas's individual level. His contributions to Spain's major tournaments were significant when he was given the opportunity. He played a decisive role in moments that directly affected Spain's success, including the final of the 2010 World Cup in Johannesburg, where his introduction from the bench and the subsequent pass that led to the tournament's only goal gave Spain the title. The pass itself was a distillation of everything he did best, simple in concept, perfect in weight and timing, unlocking a space that the defense had not quite sealed. It was not dramatic, it was precise. The decision to return to Barcelona came after the 2010-11 season. Fabregas had grown up supporting Barcelona, had been educated in their academy, and the pull of the club had always existed beneath the surface of his Arsenal years. The circumstances around the transfer were complex and took time to resolve. But eventually, in August 2011, he moved back to Catalonia. He was 24 years old, had spent 8 years in England, and was returning to a club that had won the Champions League in May of that same year, with what many considered the finest club side ever assembled. The integration into Barcelona's first team brought new challenges. At Arsenal, Fabregas had been the creative hub, the player around whom the midfield was organised. At Barcelona, he was one part of a midfield that already contained Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets, and others of comparable or greater standing within the club's hierarchy. The tactical demands were also somewhat different. Barcelona's positional play under Pep Guardiola was extraordinarily detailed in its spatial organisation. Players had very specific responsibilities regarding their positioning relative to the ball and to the space, and the system required a level of structural discipline that was more defined than the freedom Wenger had offered. Fabregas adapted, but the transition required genuine adjustment. He was not simply the same player in a different shirt. He was working within a different set of constraints and expectations. He remained at Barcelona for 2 seasons before his contract situation, and the circumstances of his role led to a new decision. Chelsea, under Jose Mourinho, made an approach in the summer of 2014, and Fabregas accepted the move. At 27, he was entering what would typically be considered the peak years of a midfielder's career, the period when physical attributes and accumulated experience combine to produce the most consistent performances. But Fabregas's trajectory was unusual, even in this regard. His physical capabilities had never been the foundation of his game, which meant that the gradual decline in those attributes, which affects every player eventually, mattered less for him than it would for a player whose effectiveness depended primarily on pace or athleticism. At Chelsea, he was deployed in a somewhat deeper position than he had typically occupied at Arsenal. Mourinho used him as the primary distributor of the team's play from midfield, the player responsible for transitioning between defensive phases and attacking phases quickly and accurately. The role suited a later stage of his development. He was less the creative architect looking to combine in tight spaces, and more the efficient orchestrator, reading the game from a slightly deeper vantage point and finding teammates with the quality of his passing range. He won the Premier League in his first season at Chelsea, the only top-flight league title of his club career, and was a consistent contributor to the team's performance throughout his time in London. The period at Chelsea also represented a visible evolution in how he played. Not a diminishment, but an adaptation. The urgency and forward movement that had characterized his Arsenal years gave way to something quieter and more controlled. He played deeper, passed more laterally, managed the pace of play more deliberately. It was the version of the player that understood his own capabilities most accurately. The acceleration was no longer the same. The stamina for box-to-box involvement was reduced, but the reading of the game, the ability to find the right pass in the right moment, the understanding of space and tempo, these remained fully intact. In some respects, they had deepened further, because his experience had added layers of reference that made pattern recognition even faster and more reliable than it had been in his youth. Fabregas moved to Monaco in the winter of 2019 at 31 years old. The move represented a continuation of the career, rather than a winding down in the conventional sense. Monaco were building a project under experienced management, and Fabregas brought qualities that were useful in that context. He was not the same player he had been at Arsenal in 2008, or even at Chelsea in 2015. He knew that, and those who worked with him knew it, but the intelligence had not diminished. It had simply been redistributed. Where once he had been the player who covered the most ground in creating danger, he was now the player who moved least but decided most efficiently. His presence in a midfield organized the team around him through the quality of his decisions rather than through physical energy. In those later years, there is a quality that long-serving footballers sometimes acquire that is difficult to describe precisely. It is a kind of settled authority that comes from having experienced enough of the game to recognize almost everything it presents. Fabregas had that quality. When he received the ball, there was no visible urgency, no search for the answer, because the answer had already been found before the ball arrived. His composure in possession in those years was, paradoxically, even more complete than it had been in his youth, not because his technical level had increased, but because his experience had made the cognitive demands of the game less taxing. He had seen every defensive shape, every pressing pattern, every form of pressure. He knew what to do with all of them. Looking back across the full arc of his career, the question that framed the beginning of this story remains worth sitting with a little longer. How was he so good so young? The answer that emerges is not a single one. It is layered, and each layer matters. The first layer is La Masia. The educational framework he encountered between 8 and 13 years old was not simply good coaching. It was a complete system for developing footballing intelligence. It taught him to scan, to position, to understand space before contact. It embedded those habits at an age when the brain absorbs and retains them most effectively. By the time he arrived at Arsenal, those habits were not learned behaviors. They were reflexes. They were the natural expression of how he understood the game. The second layer is opportunity. Many players are educated well, but never given the chance to test that education against serious competition at a young age. The gap between technically sophisticated youth football and professional competition is large, and the transition requires specific conditions. Fabregas had Wenger. He had a manager who looked at a 16-year-old and saw not the risk of playing him too early, but the cost of waiting too long, who understood that the only thing that would complete his development was the game itself, played at the highest level, with real stakes. That judgment was not simply correct, it was formative. Without regular senior competition during those critical years, the cognitive capabilities that training had built would have had no arena in which to deepen. The third layer is cognitive speed. Fabregas was not physically fast. He was mentally fast. The speed at which he processed information, identified options, and executed decisions was significantly higher than most players of his age, and significantly higher than many players of any age. This cognitive speed was partly a product of his training, the scanning habits and positional awareness that La Masia had developed. But it was also, in all likelihood, something that predisposed him to be an exceptional candidate for that kind of training. The combination of natural cognitive capacity and excellent early education produced a player who operated at a different pace inside the game, not the pace of running, but the pace of thinking. The fourth layer is psychological. He was confident without being arrogant. He was comfortable with responsibility before most people would consider him ready for it. He did not allow the awareness of his own youth to become a limitation. When he was on the pitch, he behaved like a player who belonged there, because in his own mind he did. That internal confidence was not bravado or performance. It was a genuine reflection of how he understood his own capabilities, and it allowed those capabilities to express themselves without the interference of anxiety or self-doubt. Players who are technically gifted but psychologically fragile often underperform relative to their potential. Fabregas did not underperform. He exceeded the expectations that his age would normally have set. The fifth layer, and perhaps the most subtle, is the relationship between intelligence and time. Football is a game played in time. Every decision has a window within which it is optimal. Make the pass too early, and the teammate is not yet in position. Make it too late, and the space has closed. The best midfielders in the history of the game have been those who understood the timing of their decisions most precisely. This is not something that can be separated from technical quality, because the technical execution must match the decision's timing perfectly. But it is also not reducible to technique alone. It is a form of temporal awareness, a feeling for when the moment is right, that some players have naturally, and that others develop slowly through experience. Fabregas had it at 16. Not fully formed, not yet at the peak it would reach a decade later, but present and already visible to those watching carefully. The years that followed only deepened what was already there. Barcelona refined his positional discipline. Chelsea expanded his understanding of deeper, more defensively responsible midfield roles. Monaco gave him the experience of leading a younger team from the inside. Spain gave him the experience of playing within a system of collective intelligence at the highest international level. Each phase added something, but nothing transformed him in the way that those first years at Arsenal had. Nothing produced a player as surprising, as precocious, as quietly unnerving to face, as the teenager who walked onto professional pitches in the autumn of 2003 and proceeded to play the game as if he had already been there for years. There is a final thought worth holding as the story settles. Fabregas was not a prodigy in the way that word is sometimes used, implying a brief flowering before normalization. He did not peak early, and then gradually match the level of his contemporaries as they caught up. He remained, through his 20s and into his 30s, one of the most intelligent midfielders in the game. The precocity was not a moment. It was a permanent feature of how he experienced and understood football. The game, for him, moved at a different speed than it did for most. Not faster in the sense of being overwhelming, but slower in the sense of offering more time, more clarity, more information per second than others could extract from the same environment. He was not early. He was simply seeing the game at a different speed. A player who did not wait to grow into the game, but understood it before most even began. The movement slows. The decisions become quieter. And what remains is the feeling of time moving differently around him. Good night.